Hey, salam everyone. Hey there. I am going to cover this cool topic today for biology, and we will see how far we can get in 20 minutes. So it's 8:30 p.m. Central Time. I am hoping we can share this with students who are learning about this right now in school, either in pre-AP biology or in just general biology. All right, so here we go. So, we are going to cover Darwin's theory of evolution, a topic that has had a lot of attention in the past. We can even go to the extent of saying that it has been quite a controversial topic. So, we're going to talk about who Charles Darwin was and what he theorized from his observations. Okay, I wish we had time to go over all of this, but I'm going to make the most of what we have to do. This is the TEKS, the standards that we follow in the state of Texas. So depending on where you are, you might want to go over the TEKS to make sure exactly how far you should know in this theory. All right. So by the end of class, you should be able to talk about the evidences that Charles Darwin himself found to support his theory and the principles of natural selection, also how natural selection can change a population over time. So this is going to be a big word that we will be using many times today. We will also be reviewing some words like selective breeding. Hopefully you have heard that in the past. We will talk about what artificial selection is, how that is different from natural selection, and the big E word, evolution. All right, so Darwin aboard the HMS Beagle began his journey. So he was born in United Kingdom. If you heard about him, you probably know his backstory a little bit. If you haven't, that's okay. I always like to give the students a research project at this point to find out more about his life and what led him to this discovery. So he lived in the United Kingdom, but as you can see, he traveled all the way to Galapagos Island. Now, he could have just stayed home and researched the species around him, but given the climate, the location of the United Kingdom, and given the amount of species that lived there, obviously there was not much diversity. He decided to go to a place that's closer to the equator, that's more tropical, and he can actually learn more because there's more species to study from. As you know, in science, the more information you can find, the better your conclusions will be. So he was able to observe more by traveling. So usually I ask my students, why didn't he just stay home? Well, because he wanted his research to be very sound. So he began his journey. The people at the time thought that the world was about 6,000 years old and that animals and plants were just there for many, many thousands of years. They were not really changing. So Charles Darwin obviously doubted this, and which is why he was trying to prove something else. He went around the world to prove that. This guy is amazing because he doesn't just, it's not a days or 2 days journey. It's quite a long journey, months perhaps. And he also is extremely motion sick, right? Seasick. So, with all of this throwing up and being sick all the way, he makes the trip not just to Galapagos, but also the trip around the world back home. So, we'll talk about that later, but he did go around the globe to get back home, the blue line that you can see, journey back home, with all of these illnesses and being really, really in a bad situation. Like most of us would not have traveled if we were that sick, but he went ahead and did this. So kudos to his research. So Darwin's job on the Beagle was to be a naturalist and to collect biological and geological specimens during the travel. So what is biological? Obviously, he wanted to collect some life species, right? And he also wanted to get geological species. Geo means earth, right? So he wanted to get rocks, soil, water, whatever samples he can find to prove that he has something of substance to give the world, right? So he took living things, trees, plants, and other species, and he took some abiotic things as well with him back to study. All right, so why the Galapagos Island? He went to the island because of the variety of species, because of the diversity. he immediately noticed that the different islands all seem to have their own slightly different variety of animals. So you have the mainland, and then you have these tiny islands around it. Okay. So he noticed that the birds, the finches in this case, and even some of the other reptile species, when he looked at them, he noticed minor differences in their structures. Not major, minor differences. They were all the same species, but they had slight differences. Why do you think that is? Right? If they are the same species, they should all look the same. But they looked similar, but not the same. Almost every species Darwin collected on the Galapagos was new to European scientists, though they were similar to species on the mainland South America. So European scientists hadn't really studied these species before. The island species and the mainland species should not have been so similar, unless um, unless should not have been so similar unless mainland species had changed since arriving on the islands. So he thought that these species arrived on the mainland and kind of went their own way, discovering and exploring other islands. But eventually, thousands of years later, these minor changes developed because each of these islands had something different about them, right? So these organisms had to kind of change themselves to suit those environments. Okay, Darwin continued his studies. He hypothesized that the new species could appear gradually through small changes in ancestral species. So, if you know what a hypothesis is, right, it's you basically believe something is true with some research, not blindly, but you don't have enough evidence to still say whether it's true or false. So, you have to go and prove whether it's true or false. You think it's true, but you still don't know because you're still in the experimenting or observing phase. So he hypothesized that new species could appear gradually through small changes in ancestral species. Darwin interfered that if, sorry, Darwin inferred that if humans could change species by artificial selection, so he knew this because farmers were already doing this artificial selection. What that means is you take the best horses, you have them made together so that your baby horses can be really strong for races and whatnot. Or even in plants, you take your best carrots, you take your best cucumbers, lemon, whatever, and you breed them in a way that the reproduced generations that come after them will still have all those best characteristics, right? So he thought that if humans could change the species by artificial selection, for example, if you take the fruit lemon, lemons actually are not there in nature. They were um, uh, different citrus fruits were cultivated, and mm, uh, they were kind of pollinated together so that they can come up with these fruits, which was a whole new fruit, and actually essentially a new species, right? So he was saying if human beings can do that, isn't it possible that nature can also do the same exact thing? So while farmers were directly breeding to produce offspring with the traits that they want, then perhaps the same process could work in nature as well. Hence, leading to the term natural selection. Okay, Darwin described the process of natural selection where some competitors would be better equipped for survival than others. Those less equipped would die. So if you take this bunch of flowers here, it looks like one of the flowers was really tall. The other ones weren't. For some reason, the tall flowers didn't really survive. Therefore, the smaller ones were the best. They were the best suited for this particular environment. So they get to reproduce and then have flowers that are also going to be plants that are also going to be short. If I was to give you a different example from outside the slides, I'm not that much of a great great artist. But let's say we had this looks more like a duck than a giraffe. But let's say we had giraffes with short necks, okay, and then we had some giraffes with long necks. But all the trees happen to be really tall in this area, in this environment that they live in. So because they are in this particular environment or habitat where having a tall or a long neck is actually advantageous, what happens to these little guys over here? They end up not making it, right? The trees are too tall. They can't get food, therefore, and they eventually starve to death, leaving the taller giraffes to survive. So who gets to grow up and mate and reproduce? The taller giraffes, right? So this is natural selection because the features or characteristics which are best suited to their environment, those are the ones that survive. Now, if these trees were short or we had only shrubs, right, who do you think will survive? The shorter ones, isn't it? Because the taller ones have to bend all the way. It's very inconvenient for them. They might, they might not really make it. So this doesn't happen over 1 or 2 generations. It takes a lot of time. It may even take hundreds, if not thousands of years to to have this characteristic actually take shape and form and pass on to the new generations. Now, if the environment never changed, for thousands of years it was all the same, then these species will also not need to change. But because the environments are susceptible to change, these giraffes also will change, or any animal will change to suit the environment, not immediately, but gradually throughout the generations. That brings us to the principles of natural selection. So this is something we want to learn and be thorough with. What are the principles? That means what should we check to say that natural selection will occur? Individuals, first of all, must show variation. That means if you have, let's say, a brown mountain and you have all brown rabbits, that's not really going to work as a variation. You will have some white rabbits and you will have some brown rabbits. Like just like you look at your cats, you have the calicos, you have the tabbies, you have variations in the same species. That is the variation that is within the same species. So if a fox came here or a wolf came here and tried to eat them, or let's say coyote, they will end up eating the white rabbits, and therefore the best chance at survival is for the brown rabbits because they are camouflaged into their background, isn't it? But let's say this was a white mountain, snow mountain, right? Now the rabbits that are white have a better chance than the ones that are brown. That is why you find variation in nature, because nature doesn't really know which one will survive. So it kind of puts everything out there. But eventually with time, the best or the survival of the fittest takes place. And we'll talk about survival of the fittest. The whole term is kind of misleading. We'll talk about that later. But for now, we know that all individuals show variation. Variations are heritable. So you inherit them from the previous generation, from the parents. More offspring are born than can survive. So if you look at cats, each cat can have about 5 or 6 kittens every 3 to 4 months. If you take rabbits, they can have about they can also have, I think, multiple babies in like every 2 months they reproduce, and they can have multiple baby bunnies, right? The problem is, the reason that they have so many babies is because we know that by nature, not all of them will survive. Only the best ones will survive. So if you have a weak kitten that is born with some disease, most likely it's going to die. Therefore, it's best to have as much variety as possible and as many numbers as possible. Variations that increase reproductive success will be more common in the next generation. So reproductive success, what does that mean? So when you reproduce, right, you have a higher chance of surviving. Most likely you are going to survive because your adaptations are good for the environment that you're going to be in. More offsprings are born than can survive. Variations that increase reproductive success will be more common in the next generation. So because those variations actually worked, having a long neck worked out for giraffes, right? Having a shorter stem for some plants is better than having a longer stem. It's better to be a bush than a tree. So these little variations that worked well for them give them more success with every generation that is coming after them. So those are the features or traits that will actually survive the test of time. Let's look at The Origin of Species, the book written by Darwin. He wrote this book in 1859. His backstory is really interesting, right? I advise you to kind of like look it up, because he went through a lot. He was not the first person who spoke about evolution, but he was one of the people who published it in this book. there was a lot of backlash from the church, because the church was saying something totally different. They were saying that, all the organisms were created as is, they don't change, they don't evolve, they are like that for hundreds and thousands of years. And this guy is saying something totally different, that species evolve, they change over time. So it's really interesting to see how people before him, and even he was very scared of publishing this. It took a lot of bravery to do it, because you are going to essentially risk your life. Because when you go against the church, because in United Kingdom at the time, the church and the government was the same. So whatever the Bible and the church says goes. You don't have a separate system of government, right? It was all combined together, religion and government. So if they said, no, evolution doesn't exist, no one else can come and say that evolution exists, right? If they say the earth is the center of the universe, not the sun, you can't go against that. Even if you have proof and evidence, you're scared to go against the church and the Bible. So this was a problem. We no longer have that problem, because church and government are not the same anymore. But at the time, in 1859, it was an issue. So when he published this book, right, there were also people before him who had researched and kind of suspected this, but he's the one who really ran with that idea. Today, scientists use evolution to measure cumulative change in a group of organisms through time. So we study fruit flies and we can prove, right, there is really no doubt that evolution actually does happen. And why we study fruit flies is because the lifespan is very short, and you can quickly see over time how they evolve if you change the environment, how they evolve to suit that environment. Even bacteria, how they adapt to the environment, how they evolve over time, has been studied and proven time and time again. So there is no doubt about that. Natural selection is not synonymous with evolution. It is a mechanism by which evolution occurs. So how does, if someone asks, how does evolution happen? It happens through natural selection. Okay, it happens because there is this system of selection where the best characteristics or traits get to survive from generation to generation, hence giving rise to new species over time. So you might have a bird with a sharp beak, or we can say it's a finch, and in the next generation, that sharp beak is slightly blunter, because maybe the trees, the barks don't need that much of a sharp beak, and then it becomes blunter and blunter and blunter until you get to a generation where the beak is completely blunt and not sharp at all. So this happens over a long period of time. There's a slight from generation to generation. You might not notice the slight difference, but if you look at the early ancestors and the modern species, you will see quite a big difference between the way they have evolved, which is what Charles Darwin observed in the Galapagos Islands. Now, in science, you cannot just say something and keep quiet. You have to be able to prove it. You have to prove your theory with number of evidences. So your hypothesis has now become a theory. Why? Because you were able to find enough evidence to support it. And therefore, it is now no longer a hypothesis. It is a theory. So let's go over a few evidences which prove evolution actually exists, and maybe a few new words like morphology and biochemistry, so that you can understand why we are so convinced that evolution is not just a bizarre concept, but an actual reality that is actually happening as we speak right now, right? So over many generations, you will find the species changing slightly, giving rise to even maybe a slightly new, maybe a new species, right? So let's go over some key words of the lesson over here. Vestigial structures, analogous structures, and then we'll probably come up with at least 4 or 5 reasons, or the better word is evidence, to prove that evolution actually exists. All right. So we all know that the theory of evolution states that all organisms on Earth have descended from a single ancestor. So we believe there was one ancestor, and from them different branches or species have evolved. Recall that theories provide explanations for natural phenomena based on observations. So a theory is basically an explanation for something that naturally occurs based on our evidence and observation. Darwin's On the Origin of Species demonstrates how evolution might happen and evidence of its occurrence, which we are going to see in this lesson. Okay, so very quickly, I have five evidences here: the fossil record, the comparative anatomy, embryology, biochemistry, and geographic distribution. So we'll go over them, not in very much detail because we have a time constraint, but we will touch each one of them to see how and why they can prove evolution. Number one, the fossil record. So the fossils are the remains of the organism. It doesn't have to be bones or teeth. It can even be a footprint, right? We can define fossil in various ways, not just, some people think it's just a shell and the bones. It's not. It can be anything, even just a paw print. Fossils show modern species resemble ancient species. So if you look at the fossil record, so we can tell which one is modern and which one is old because of the layers of rock and geology, study of geology. But if we are able to compare those different fossils, we can say that the species look like the olden species. The new species look like the olden species. For example, um, the Glyptodont was an ancient ancestor of the modern armadillo. We have armadillos around, but we don't have this guy anymore. Why? Because this guy eventually over time kind of evolved. Maybe the environment that it lived in didn't favor the traits that it had. The conditions that it had probably wasn't working very well for the environment. So it slowly evolved into something like our modern armadillos, which had a better chance of survival given the habitat they were in. So yes, the first thing is the fossils of the past look similar to the fossils of the modern species. That's one evidence. They also reveal that some species have changed very little. So sometimes the species don't change much because the environment hasn't changed. There's no need for change to occur because those traits worked and they continue to work generation after generation. So they don't really change that much. The fossil record is an important source of information for determining the ancestry of organisms and the patterns of evolution. So you can actually go back and look at all the different fossils, let's say bone structure, and you can compare them and you can see how similar they are to modern species that we have. And this is a good evidence for evolution. Darwin predicted the existence of fossils intermediate in form between the species such as Archaeopteryx. So we also have organisms that, between being a dinosaur and a bird, it went through an in-between phase for some time. So it's an intermediate form that can happen from one species to another. They kind of look like a mix of both species. Research consider two major class of traits when studying transitional fossils: derived traits, ancestral traits. I think we go over this even in middle school. Derived traits are newly evolved features like feathers that do not appear in the fossil of common ancestors. So the common ancestor, right? So we said we have one ancestor and we said the other species slowly with time kind of like evolve out of that common ancestor. Derived traits are newly evolved features such as feathers that do not appear in the fossil of common ancestors. So this is a derived trait because there were no feathers before, but feathers start appearing. Ancestral traits are more primitive features such as teeth, teeth and tail that do appear in ancestral form. So some parts of this organism were there even before, in the species that came before, and therefore is again a kind of a proof. This is an ancestral trait, so this is going to prove to us that these traits were visible from generations ago, indicating that there is some reason of evidence for evolution. So once we are done studying the fossil record, which is a very obvious evidence for evolution, we can move on to comparative anatomy. So anatomy, or the structure of organisms, you can see here we are comparing a human, a horse, a cat, a porpoise, and a bat, right? There is a similar structure in all of them. Anatomical similarities, similar structures inherited from a common ancestor are called homologous structures. Homo means the same, homologous structures. So if you look at these limbs, if you take a really close look at them, they kind of have similarities. Evolution predicts that organism body parts are more likely to be modifications of ancestral body parts than entirely new structures. So we believe that the ancestor slowly evolved into the next structure instead of an entirely new structure forming. So, if you look at the cat and the horse, for example, you can see that it's so similar in the structure, and just a few in years or generations later, the similarities kind of, they kind of, you kind of evolve. There are so many similarities that you can't, they don't even look like they are totally different organisms, right? They look like they came from the previous organisms. This is another good evidence to compare the anatomy of different organisms. And we can, another example, another reason, a good reason why we kind of believe evolution actually happens is because of vestigial structures. Vestigial structures are the reduced forms of functional structures in other organisms. So, for example, the appendix that humans have probably served a good purpose in previous um, organisms, ancestral organisms, but they don't serve a good enough purpose. Therefore, right now we don't have a good enough reason to use them, but they're still there, not completely gone away. Maybe the evolution didn't is still in the process of happening. So if you look at the snake pelvis, right? Snake don't really need a pelvis, but they have it, and it's vestigial. It's not necessary, but they have it because for some reason the ancestral species probably had a pelvis. Um, Another example, which is not on the slides here, is the tailbone or the coccyx of humans. We have a tailbone, even though we don't have a tail. So one would question why that is. If we are not no longer needing to use it, it was actually a balance, part of the balance for organisms that have tails. They need to use it. So that's something that is a thought for us to think about why these vestigial structures exist in one organism. A structure that doesn't really do anything, there's no function, but the structure does exist. Analogous structures can be used for the same purpose and be superficially similar in construction, but are not inherited from a common ancestor. So, what are analogous structures? That means there are two different structures, they're analogous, but they are used for the same purpose. And they can be somewhat similar in construction, but not from a common ancestor. What are those? So, if you think about structures like wings, right? Dragonflies have wings, birds have wings, bats have wings, right? They all do the same job, they have the same functionality, but the structure is different. Analogous structures show that functionality similar features can evolve independently under similar conditions. So even though those are completely different structures, they are performing the same function. They probably evolved from in different situations, in different environments, to do a job which can be done by multiple different types of structures. So a dragonfly's or butterfly's wings are very different from a bat's or bird's wings, yet they do the same function. So it's probably because of the way they have evolved. Now we move on to the fourth one, embryology. Embryology is looking at the embryos of organisms, different organisms. So one of the activities that we can give students is to give the ultrasound image of a horse, a bat, a baby, a human baby, and maybe a mouse, and ask them. Let's give an insect also. I don't know, maybe the fly. Give all of these black and white ultrasound images to a student and tell them, hey, can you pinpoint and say which one is a horse, which one is a ape, which one is a human baby, which one is a cat, and just mix and match. Almost most of the time, very often, it's very difficult to tell because the embryo at the embryo stage of life of different species, they almost always look exactly the same. An embryo is an early pre-birth stage of an organism's development. Vertebrate embryos exhibit homologous structures during phases of development that become totally different structures in the adult form. So this is now showing you that the pre-birth stage, so you're still not born, the embryo. So just to give you a quick background, an embryo is, you first have a fetus and then it eventually becomes an embryo. Okay, so in the embryonic stage, vertebrate embryos exhibit homologous structures during the process of development that become totally different structures in adult form. So if you look at the embryos, they will have structures that look similar before birth, pre-birth. But once they are born, they eventually become different structures. Another indication that evolution actually is occurring. The last one here is biochemistry, right? So if we look at the DNA biochemistry of an organism, DNA is basically a molecule. It's a complex molecule, but it's still a molecule. If you look at the molecular structure of the DNA of different organisms, for example, if you take a moth, a fish, a turtle, a duck, and so on, a turtle's DNA and a duck's DNA is very similar. So, a duck's DNA and a pig's DNA is very similar. But a butterfly's DNA and a pig's DNA is not very similar. There is a difference in the DNA the further they are away from the relationship. You're going to learn something called cladograms. You'll talk about how closely they are related. For example, Candida and moth, how closely they are related, and so on. Number of amino acids different. So amino acids is something to do with our proteins. Um, how similar they are, how different they are to a human baby. All of this can be mapped and studied. Common ancestry can be seen in the complex metabolic molecules that many different organisms share. The more closely related species are to each other, the greater the biochemical similarities. So we do actually share a lot of our genetics, our DNA, our amino acids with other species in the living organism spectrum. And this is also a very good evidence that we have actually evolved from a more primitive organism in the past. Geographic distribution. So where are we located? The distribution of plants and animals that Darwin were what he saw, the distribution of plants and animals that Darwin were what first suggested evolution to him. Distribution of plants and animals around the world is studied in the field of biogeography. So where are these organisms located is key. Why? Evolution is linked to migration patterns, climate, and geological forces such as plate tectonics. So you guys all know about plate tectonics. You know how the continents moved. And because of that moving of the continents, different organisms adapted. So you'll have one continent like that, but then it splits and moves. So the organism which was here got separated. They got separated, the species got separated. So these guys evolved into something else because their environment was suitable for that. And these guys evolved into something else because their environment was suitable for that. And therefore, you have now two different species based on the location, but they did come from a common ancestor. Another evidence for evolution. Types of adaptations. So why do organisms adapt, and what is it, right? An adaptation is a trait shaped by natural selection that increases an organism's reproductive success. So we keep saying reproductive success is because it's not like the organism itself changes. It's not like, for example, let's say a deer with very long horns it's good. It's a good feature for them because they can fight off their predators. But it's not going to just start growing long horns then and there, right? It has to be in the generation after that the horns become longer and longer and longer, right? Eventually leading to a species that really have really long horns. So that is reproductive success, right? And it's an adaptation that becomes more prominent with every generation that comes. Fitness is a measure of the relative contribution an individual trait makes to the next generation. So when you say survival of the fitness, it just means that those adaptations are best suited for the current environment that they were in. It's not that those are better, or it's better to have a bushier tail or a thicker coat of fur. No, it's if you are in a colder environment, it makes sense to have a thick coat of fur. Just like if you are closer to the equator and you have a lot of sunlight, then it's better for your skin to have more melanin because you want to block out some of those dangerous rays of sun from entering your skin, right? So depending on your environment, the best features get they kind of like they get carried on to the next generation. And the ones that don't are not very fit, that don't work in the environment, they eventually kind of like die off. The better an organism is adapted to its environment, the greater the chances of survival and reproductive success. So basically, the features or traits that work well in that environment will continue to go down the generations. Camouflage is a suite of morphological adaptations that allow an organism to blend into its environments. Mimicry is another type of so I'll go over this next class because we are already up with our time. But basically, camouflage is when you blend into into the environment because of your color or some other reason. And mimicry is where you copy, right? So you have insects that look like plants. You have plants that look like insects. That's mimicry. Antimicrobial resistant developments in some bacteria in response to sublethal exposure to antibiotics. So this is one of the big topics I discuss with my students about why we shouldn't be taking antibiotics for the slightest thing. Because bacteria can evolve very fast and they can be resistant to the antibiotics very fast. And eventually, those antibiotics will not work for you. You'll need stronger and stronger doses because the bacteria that is in your body is probably adapted and evolved, and they can be resistant. Resistant means they are not going to be affected by the antibiotics you take. So that is pretty much all of what I wanted to cover today. Consequences: not all features of an organism are necessarily adaptive. Some features are consequences of other evolved characteristics. Helplessness of human babies, right? So our babies are not like horses and camels. They don't jump out of the womb and start walking. Why? Because we are actually giving birth to our babies earlier than they are ready to be born, and we are taking care of them for a long time. So they are not born. They are basically in the world of organisms and species. They are being born too early, so they're not ready to get up and start walking the moment they are born. Whereas deer and donkey and cats and dogs, when the moment they are born, they've had enough gestation time to jump out of the uterus and then start walking. So this is a evolved characteristic. So we've actually evolved to give birth earlier than some other organisms. It also may be because we have a large brain size and upright posture. So we keep saying maybe because we're not sure exactly why the human babies are born earlier than they should be born. All right, so we went over the different evidences for evolution. We talked about morphology, biochemistry, a bunch of new vocab words. I hope this was helpful. And yep, please leave a comment if there's anything that I can answer later on. I will be happy to do so. Thank you and good night.